Want to know how you're doing at work before you get fired? There's a way to learn about your performance, what's working, what needs to be improved before it's too late. I'm going to teach you 3 ways to find out how you're doing at work that will make even the most evasive boss open up to you. And we're also going to talk about how to listen for feedback when it's not direct. This is a follow-up to our video about why Gen Z is getting fired. Go watch it if you haven't already. We're hearing from a lot of folks that they aren't being told what they're doing wrong. So I'm going to teach you 3 foolproof ways to get insights about people's perceptions of your performance. Agree, disagree, it doesn't matter. You have to know what people think about your performance because perception is reality. And once you know what the perception is, you can start to manage it before you get fired. I'm Gabby from She Makes It Work. And while I have decades of experience both giving and receiving feedback, not all of which I liked, I was once like you, new to the corporate world, trying to navigate a confusing workplace where everyone but me seemed to know the language and just magically knew what to do. I don't want you to have to learn the hard way. So let's get into learning the system so that you can make the system work for you. Number 1 is finding out how you're doing by asking as you go. It doesn't have to be a big, scary conversation. In fact, the best way to learn about how you're doing is to ask about the small things, because those are the things that, if left unresolved, add up to big problems. So how do you ask as you go? If you have a work assignment, ask how it's looking once you have a solid draft. I teach this to new consultants all the time. Don't wait for it to be 100% done and then hand it over. Get incremental feedback on your work as you go. For example, you may be working on a presentation, a report, or a design for a new screen, or even a spreadsheet or a document your boss requested. We call these deliverables because it's something tangible you're creating to hand over for someone else's use. Whoever is going to be using it is your end user or your customer. Yes, customers can be internal as well. As soon as you get a visual fleshed out, a format with enough content that it's starting to make sense, sit with the person and ask them if it's heading in the right direction. If they say yeah, or shrug, or give any sort of vague response, that either means they don't actually like it, or it's not far enough along for them to tell if they like it, or they're not paying attention. Not paying attention happens way more than you think. Even if they ask for something, it's still not their top priority, even if it's yours. So if they're exhibiting any of these behaviors, you need to dig deeper. Ask them what they like about it, and ask them what could work better. Ask these as separate questions, and let them respond in between. 9 times out of 10, this gets them to actually think about it versus just nodding along, and can lead to very engaging conversations. This is a really collaborative way to do your work and make sure that you're getting feedback along the way. The benefits are that this demonstrates that you care about your work. Even if your work isn't perfect, it's not going to be at first, that's just reality. People are much more likely to be forgiving if they are engaged in the process with you, and if you show you care. This is part of the social game at work. Getting feedback on a work product along the way is much easier than getting feedback later when it's too late. Easier for them and for you. Not only does this prevent late nights staying up fixing a deliverable, something we've all had to do more than once, it also means that the final product is just better. You know more about what it needs to look like. Remember, more often than not, whoever you're working with isn't used to training new hires, and they may not be experienced or experts at giving feedback. You can take control of this by making it easier for them. Why should you do that? Because this is your paycheck on the line, and this is your career. This is how you take control of your path, by making sure you know what people think about your work. When they do tell you what they do and don't like about the work product, listen with an open mind. And if their feedback doesn't make sense, ask follow-up questions. Here are some examples of great follow-up questions. I use these with clients all the time, and I teach consultants to use them as well. Can you give me an example of where you've seen that done before? I'm having trouble picturing that. What could that look like? Tell me more about what you're picturing. I'm starting to get an idea, but I want to make sure I understand. What not to do. Do not argue. This comes off as defensive, even if you don't mean it that way. Do not tell them they should have told you that earlier, or they didn't tell you, etc. Again, this has no value in the conversation and comes across as defensive. Make sure to thank them for their input and validate that it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, try to keep talking. If you start to feel frustrated, we're human, it happens, and frankly, I used to get frustrated all the time. Let them know that you're gonna go back and see what you can do with it, but you might have some follow-up questions. This gives you time to settle down and come back when you're feeling a little bit more cool-headed if it's still not making sense. Also do this if they're starting to get frustrated. Number 2, ask for feedback after every assignment, task, or project. Does it seem like overkill? It's not. How else are you going to know how you did? A lot of people assume that the absence of feedback means that they're doing well. This is not true. If someone doesn't say great job, it's not a great job. And sometimes even when people do say that, they don't mean it. That's one of the hardest lessons to learn about the corporate world. How much goes unspoken, or even how insincere people can be. So remember, after everything you do, especially the first, second, and third times you do something new, ask for feedback. Now, you can be sitting there thinking, Gabby, it's not fair that people are insincere and that needs to change. It's not fair that people don't tell me things that they're thinking and that needs to change. I agree with you. I am known as being someone who gives very frequent and very direct feedback, whether it's little or big. I can't change the world on my own, neither can you. What I'm trying to teach you is how to work within the system so that you can still be successful until things do change about how people give feedback. That's just the way it is. Okay, here are a list of questions to ask to get people to open up. Yes, saying any feedback might work, but most of the time it just doesn't. The point here is to get everyone to open up, not just people who like giving feedback. Here we go. How do you think that went? What else would you want to have seen in that meeting, on that slide? I know Jim said he was okay with that chart, but I wasn't sure. Is there anything I could have done to make it more impactful? I'd love to know what you thought went well. I thought that presentation went pretty well, but I still think I could improve. Do you have any thoughts on what I could have done differently? This one's my favorite. The client seemed disengaged or uninterested. Do you have any tips on what I could do differently to keep her attention? Remember, the trick is to ask questions in a way that shows you are interested in learning and growing. Demonstrating an interest in growth is just as important as continuing to learn. Your goal here is to make it safe and easy for people to give you feedback. And if they tell you something that's hard to hear or that you don't like, take a breath and try to understand what they're saying. When bosses say people seem like they don't care, this is one of the things they're talking about. They're looking for employees who don't just try to do the job, but who also ask questions about how it went. This is especially important if you're getting a vibe that they don't like you. I hear this all the time. Newer folks complain that their boss doesn't like them or these coworkers don't like them. What actually happens is that there is something about the way you're doing your job that doesn't work for them, and then their behavior starts to change. Yes, it would be better if they're direct. Unfortunately, that's clearly not happening. So instead of thinking it's personal or that it's something out of your control, get curious about what could be going wrong. If I had to say one magic phrase that could turn you into someone that people will open up to, it's to be curious about everything. Be curious about the assignment. Be curious about how you're doing at the smallest level. Be curious about what's working and what's not. Curiosity is an openness to learning. Curiosity is never defensive or closed off. The more open you are, the more people want to open up to you. And this leads me to the third way to ask for feedback. Monthly one-on-one feedback with your boss. Every month or so, ask your boss in a one-on-one how it's going, where you're learning well, and where maybe you need to lean in more. If you don't have weekly one-on-ones with your boss or supervisor, this is the number one reason you're not getting feedback. Ask for weekly or bi-weekly check-ins. Some bosses resist this, so don't push it too hard if they don't want to do it, but if they don't give you one-on-one time, they are not supporting you. Even bad bosses know they're supposed to be giving you their time. They know they're supposed to be developing you. In as friendly a way as possible, ask what cadence of check-ins works for them. This implies that this is a normal activity and it subtly reminds them of their responsibility. Subtlety is key here. Now, in every check-in, ask for feedback. But if they're not giving it to you, then every month in the one-on-one, ask them this specific question. It's really important for me to make sure I'm learning and growing in my role. Could you tell me a couple things you've noticed that I'm doing well, and maybe one or two things that I could work harder on? This will usually give even the most reluctant boss an opening. Let me re-emphasize. Use this only if asking for feedback doesn't work. If they are already giving you feedback, and then you ask again, it's going to make it look like you're not listening or paying attention. I do have to say, I've had employees who I've given feedback to and who I've been actively coaching, who then asked me some variation on what I just told you, and then I do remind them of the feedback I've given them. Don't be that employee. If your boss or supervisor or coworker has given you feedback, please take the feedback, apply it, And in your next meeting, ask if they've seen improvement or if they like the way you applied their feedback. This is one of my biggest tips about feedback. Don't assume that your change is working just because they never mention it again. It's on you to follow up with them. Let me know if you want a follow-up video on how to do this. It is extremely important. Okay, here's a bonus point for this section. If you are still not getting any feedback from anyone, and if your company has a feedback tool, such as Workday, send a feedback request in writing. That way you have a paper trail that you are asking for feedback and want to learn and grow. Now, on to the next part, how to listen for feedback effectively. Now that you've asked for feedback, how do you make sure that you actually understand and use it effectively? A lot of feedback at work isn't always obvious. It can be subtle, indirect, or even hidden in changes in how your manager interacts with you. Let's go over how to recognize it, process it, and use it to improve. Number 1, recognize subtle feedback cues. Sometimes feedback isn't given directly, but it doesn't mean it isn't there. Your boss isn't always sitting down and saying, I have some feedback for you. Sometimes they just tell you things. Here are some common phrases that might be indirect feedback. It might be better if you handle it this way. Next time, I think we should take a different approach. I'd like you to focus more on specific area in the future. These are all examples of feedback. Even if it's phrased in a subtle way, it's important to pay attention. Another form of subtle feedback comes from changes in behavior. For example, increased micromanagement. If your manager suddenly starts checking in more frequently or gets more involved in your work, that could indicate they're not feeling confident about your approach. It can also mean they're hearing feedback about you that they haven't passed on. Being left out of meetings. If you're no longer included in meetings or discussions you were part of before, it could mean you need to demonstrate more value in those settings. The key is to be aware of how your manager's tone or involvement changes and treat it as an opportunity to learn. Again, this is a great example of a signal for you to get curious. I have a really good example of this. When I was earlier in my career, I was a development at a small company, and I noticed that I stopped being invited to certain developer meetings. And I did ask my boss about it. I mustered up my courage and I sat down and I got curious and I said, hey, I noticed that I'm not being invited to the developer weekly meeting anymore. Can you tell me why? And he looked a little uncomfortable and shifty, and I just sat there, demonstrating my open-mindedness. And he said, I noticed you don't talk a lot in that meeting, so I felt like it maybe wasn't valuable to you. Interesting. So I took that to heart and I expressed to him, I'm learning a lot right now. I'm early in my career, I'm new to this company, and I really like to observe the first few times I'm in a meeting so that I can learn from the people who have been there longer and are more experienced. I really want to speak in the meeting and contribute, and now that I know that that is an expectation, I will absolutely try to start speaking up because I do feel like I've learned a lot from the ones I went to. So I want to go because I want to continue learning from my peers who are more experienced than I am. And I do want to contribute, and I feel like I need a little bit more time before I'm comfortable being vocal. So it's really interesting because I would never have thought that was an expectation, or I actually would have thought my manager would know I just need a little time to warm up. This is all new to me, and I do like to observe before I start interacting or before I start being super vocal. But that's the thing about communication. Everybody's making assumptions about what other people think, what other people know, what they should be doing. You don't know sometimes until you ask. So getting curious can really help you. Once I explained that to him, I was re-added to the meeting. I did start speaking up, and I made sure that, again, since I knew that that's what people were looking for, I made sure I was vocal and I was visibly engaged in the meeting. It can be really, really easy, especially for those of us that are introverts, to just kind of be silently taking things in, and we don't always understand that that comes off as looking disengaged or uninterested. If I hadn't done that, I think I would have eventually been let go. In fact, we had layoffs after that, and I survived the layoffs, and I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't have cared to keep me, frankly, if I hadn't demonstrated that I cared enough to ask, that I cared enough to listen to what I was being told, and that I cared enough to change the behavior that they were measuring me on. Because you don't always know what you're measured on, unfortunately. There's a lot of unspoken rules in the corporate world that everybody just seems to know, but they learn it through observing and they learn it through asking. So give yourself some grace that you don't know all the unspoken rules, because of course you don't. But you also may need to remind the people around you that you don't either, and ask them, what should I be doing in this situation? That's why asking is so powerful. My next tip is somewhat related to that, and it is practice active listening. When receiving feedback, active listening is critical. It shows you care about what's being said, and it helps you truly understand the message. Here are some tips. Take notes. It might seem simple, but writing down the feedback you receive does two things. It keeps you focused and helps prevent you from tuning out. Plus, you can refer to these notes later to ensure you're making progress. I do have a pro tip about taking notes. If you are virtual, your manager or whoever's giving you the feedback can't always visibly tell that you're taking notes, and it might make you look disengaged. So if you're taking notes and it's not obvious that that's what you're doing, like in person, writing on a notepad, make sure to tell your manager, this is great feedback. I'm jotting down notes and I'm really listening. That makes sure that they understand what you're doing. Again, it's this unspoken stuff where we all make assumptions about what we think other people know. So yes, take notes, but if you're virtual, make sure to tell the other person that that's what you're doing and that you're really paying attention and that you are genuinely hearing the feedback. Next, ask clarifying questions. If you're not sure what your manager means, ask for an example. For instance, you can say, can you give me an example of what you mean by improving my communication? This shows that you want to get it right and that you value their input. Make sure that you're hearing what is not working well about your communication, and make sure to get an example of what would work better. Otherwise, how can you know? And while I don't believe in arguing because it looks defensive, I do think it's okay when you're asking a clarifying question that you can say, I really want to learn how to communicate in the way that works here. I'm doing what I know, but I know I have a lot to learn. So I really appreciate you telling me what it is that works better. Next, paraphrase back. To make sure you've understood, paraphrase what you've heard back to them. You could say, so what I'm hearing is that you'd like me to take more initiative when problems come up. This not only helps you process the feedback, but also gives your manager the chance to correct any misunderstandings. I can tell you that as a leader and a people manager, whenever I've given someone feedback, especially when it's difficult feedback, meaning it's pretty serious, it's something that could genuinely impact their career if they don't take the feedback and make the adjustment. One of the ways I know the feedback conversation is going well is when they actually restate for confirmation. That's what we call it in the consulting world, by the way, is restate for confirmation. If you're paraphrasing it back to your manager will understand and really be impressed by how much you're trying to hear the feedback. I'm saying this not to be dramatic, but again, this is a follow-up to the video about Gen Z getting fired and a lot of Gen Z folks saying that they don't know what they're doing wrong. That is the consequence. Like if you are being given feedback and if you don't understand it, and if you aren't asking clarifying questions and you're not paraphrasing it back and you're not demonstrating that you're trying to apply the feedback, it may be too late for you. And maybe that's okay with you. Maybe that job wasn't the best fit for you and you're okay that you got fired. But I'm assuming you're watching this video because you want to be employed and want to know what you can do to take control of your career. This is one of the biggest things you can do to take control of your career is control and manage how you respond to feedback. Which leads me to my next point, number 3, be open-minded and avoid defensiveness. I've given a few examples of what defensiveness looks like. It is natural to feel defensive when you receive feedback, but it's important to remind yourself that feedback is meant to help you grow. Here's how you can stay open. Think of feedback as data. It's not a judgment of who you are. It's information you can use to improve. By framing it as data, you can be more objective about it. Also, take a deep breath. If you feel defensive, pause and take a deep breath before responding. It's okay to say, thank you for the feedback. I'd like to take some time to think about this and come back with questions if that's okay. People understand you might need a little bit of time to process emotionally and intellectually. Number 4, look for nonverbal cues. Feedback isn't always verbal, Pay attention to nonverbal cues like body language and facial expressions. If your manager seems hesitant or looks uncomfortable when talking about a particular area, that could be a sign that they're trying to give you difficult feedback, even if they're not being clear about it. Responding with an open posture and nodding can make it easier for them to share honestly. When I was growing in my career, especially when I switched into my second career, when I switched into consulting, I had an account manager who was amazing at coaching me through some of the consulting skills and account management skills that I just hadn't developed yet. But there was one time where she seemed really uncomfortable and we were talking about something, and it had to do with my professional presence. And this was something where maybe it was a sensitive area, maybe she knew that this conversation could go south very easily, but I could tell that she was kind of tiptoeing around giving me the feedback. And so I made sure to lean in, and I was like, hey, I feel like you're trying to tell me something. It's okay to speak directly to me about this. It's okay to just tell me whatever's on your mind. Let me know what it is. And so then she gave me the feedback about my professional appearance. I did not like it. I'm not gonna lie and say it was easy. It wasn't, but I'm glad she told me, because again, it's all about perceptions. And once she told me about this perception, I was then able to change how I was showing up and then change the perception. If I hadn't done that, where I really leaned in and showed that I was open and drew her out with both my body language and my words, I would never have actually known, and that would have negatively impacted my career. This is true for most of your leaders that you're working with. They all have something that makes them uncomfortable to talk about. Look for those signs of discomfort. Show your own openness through your body language, through your face, and through your words, and get them to open up. Listening for feedback is more than just hearing the words. It's about recognizing subtle cues, being proactive in understanding the message, and taking deliberate actions to grow. With active listening, an open mind, and a commitment to reflection, you'll be able to turn even the most indirect feedback into an opportunity for growth and managing the perceptions of those around you. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope these strategies help you feel more confident about asking for feedback. And most importantly, knowing how to listen for it, even when it's subtle. Remember, knowing how you're doing by getting feedback is your secret weapon for growing in your role and making sure you're always on the right track. It's really important to know what people think about your performance so you can manage it. If you found this helpful, and especially if you didn't, have you tried any of these approaches before? Did you learn something new about feedback today? Drop a comment below. I'd love to start a conversation about your experiences with feedback. What worked, what didn't, or even the challenges you're facing right now. I'm here to help. And remember, your questions might help others too. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tips on how to help you grow your career. See you next time.